I know I have some people who are trying to get in on the phone and not able to, so I regret that very much. But I think everyone knows me. I'm Connie Nestor, and I've had the delightful experience of chairing this forum for about 10 years. And I would like to remind everybody that the Scottish American History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrews Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois, later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, which is located in North Riverside, Illinois. And Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to the support of Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. For additional information, please access our website, www.chicagoscots.org, and please give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care charity. And if everyone now will please mute your microphones for our speakers, I would like to officially call on Gus Noble, our president of Caledonia and Chicago Scots, to greet everyone, to say a few words. And Gus, maybe you'll tell us a little bit about our upcoming festival, please.
Sure, thank you, Connie. I won't take everyone's time too much because I know that the speaker has lots to say. And Alastair, I'm looking forward to your presentation this morning, having thoroughly enjoyed the one you delivered previously. We do have a festival coming up, as Connie says. Our Scottish Festival and Highland Games will be the third weekend in June. And I see Jim Sim is on the line with us. Jim has given terrific leadership to the piping community over the years as head of the Midwest Pipe Band Association, and more recently as one of the chairs of the festival. Jim, through your leadership, our festival has, and the piping part of the festival has grown into the largest or one of the largest in North America. And I just want to thank you very much for your vision, your leadership, and your energy. And thanks also for the kind words that you and others on the call sent over to me. Messages of support for my father and my family were really, really appreciated. And I can never thank you enough for them. We also have a special visitor this week. He arrives in Chicago today for the first time. He'll be here on Monday and Tuesday before heading off to Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston. And that is Phil Long, the new chief executive of the National Trust for Scotland. And we're looking forward to hearing Phil's vision for the National Trust at an event we'll host at the Racket Club on Tuesday evening.
Here on Monday and Tuesday.
I just want to give one plug for Caledonia Senior Living. Connie, do you want to ask everyone to mute again? Was that what you were going to do, or am I speaking too quickly or quietly?
No, I was going to ask them to mute their mics, but I think Jack took care of that. Thank you.
Okay. I have one plug for Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. If you are able to and you qualify, and I'm going to let everybody know how old I am. I got my 4th shot yesterday, my booster, which means I am in that over 50 age group. Please do. It protects not only you, but everybody in positions of vulnerable health, especially seniors. So I appreciate everyone's support through vaccination and through your messages of support for our staff. They truly are continuing to be heroic in the face of the challenge of COVID and now staffing. Staffing is a huge challenge for every field of operation, particularly in elder care. So those who are showing through their dedication to caring a commitment to Caledonia are even more heroic than they have been the last couple of years, and they appreciate your support, your messages, and anything you can do to big them up, as they say. So with that, I'll I'll hand back to you, Connie, and say how much I'm looking forward to, Alastair, your remarks. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions following the presentation.
Thank you so much, Gus. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, and thanks for making time today. And your father and your family are in our prayers, of course. You touched on this, but I just want to announce officially that we are going to hold the Scottish Festival and Highland Games this year on June 17th and 18th at Hamilton Lakes in Itasca. This is going to be complete with caber tossing and Highland dancing, entertainment, Scottish foods and marketplace. We'll be crowning the Heather Queen. We'll have athletic contests, the March of the Clans, and much, much more. And I want to encourage everyone to come and visit the history and genealogy tents. And you can buy your tickets on the Chicago Scots website, www.chicagoscots.org. And George and Alfred, I'm counting on you as volunteers at the history tent this year. So don't make any other plans. Okay, well, now I think it's time to move forward with our presentation. Jack, I don't know, I'm still getting messages that people are having trouble getting in, so I don't know what's going on today. We'll have to figure that out. But I am so tremendously pleased to have with us live from Scotland and back by popular demand, Professor Alastair Mann. And he is a senior lecturer in the Department of History, University of Stirling. And Alastair is going to speak to us today on the Council, the Union, and the Patriot. So Alastair, why don't you please take it away? We're going to dim everybody's cameras and microphones so that we can focus on what Alastair has to say. Welcome, Dr. Mann.
Thank you very much, Connie. It's a pleasure to be invited back. And thank you and for the welcome. And good to see that Chicago's Scots are in fine fettle, which is fabulous. You asked me to give a second talk, and you particularly asked me, Connie, to talk about the Privy Council. And as this is an institution, it might have seemed a rather dull prospect, which in some respects is why I've found a way to marry the talk with a discussion about Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun as well. And given that I explained it last time, my background, I'm not going to linger on my complicated personal history of a journey from publishing to academia. If you want to hear all that, you can hear my talk on James the 7th. But anyway, to the Privy Council, don't tell me that my PowerPoint hasn't launched yet. I'll launch it shortly, Connie. Okay, it's all fine. In 2020, the universities of Stirling and Dundee were the recipients of a Leverhulme Trust Research Project grant to study the Scottish Privy Council in the period 1689 to 1708. 1708 is the year it was abolished. The Scottish Privy Council project, under my direction, aims to explore the records of this period and to create a wide range of published outputs and an online platform of the main records of the Council for use by historians and the public at large. Today, I will speak to you on the significance of the Scottish Privy Council, consider a few certain unique and universal qualities of it, and also outline the main aims of the project, which is due to conclude in spite of delays due to COVID, because we couldn't get to archives, basically, which were closed in 2024. Finally, through Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun, I will explore the ideas that underpin institutional development in pre-modern Scotland and make some contrasts with the present day, some of which are right up to the present day. A background theme will be the thorny question of union, something which I know Americans have found a thorny question in the past and present. So let me see if I can launch my website, what am I talking about? My presentation, rather. Right, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, excellent. Good news, good news. Okay, let's begin by looking at Privy Councils old and new. Throughout history, kings, queens, and emperors gathered around themselves retinues of followers and advisors. Within these extended groups, some key individuals were chosen as the vehicles for effective government. The chief priests, justices, captains, and administrators of the realm. So it was that in pre-modern Western Christendom, the foundations for councils were laid. How did Scotland experience this? Leading to the emergence of its own council. And do these relate in any way to modern government? Today, it may surprise you, the still existing Privy Council of the United Kingdom may seem an ancient institution with limited significance. Even to those who are aware of it, it will be assumed to hold meetings with the monarch to agree ceremonial issues of minor importance. However, in spite of the apparent opacity of its deliberations and relative insignificance compared with the Westminster Parliament, where important decisions are made, obviously, the Privy Council of the UK still has extensive prerogative powers. It retains a judicial remit for Crown dependencies, like Jersey and Guernsey and the Isle of Man, and hears judicial appeals mostly related to the death penalty from those Commonwealth countries who have not abandoned a connection to the British Constitution, even though such arrangements are a throwback to the Empire, the British Empire. In spite of many Commonwealth countries developing their own appeal courts since the late 1940s, those continuing to look to the UK Privy Council number 30, including Grenada, Gibraltar, Mauritius, Jamaica, for example. One of the committees it has even oversees amendments to the statutes of the ancient universities of Scotland, St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Edinburgh. And by the way, this first slide is the current website for my project. You're welcome to visit it. It's got some interesting stuff. The UK Council, of course, has various Scottish members, including First Ministers, past and present, that head the devolved government of Scotland since the new Scottish Parliament first sat in 1999. Scotland's Privy Council in the pre-modern period was appointed by a commission of the monarch at the start of a new reign, and at various moments in between when the monarch fancied a new team. Nowadays, a new monarch does not automatically produce new councillors, and individuals are appointed for life using the label Right Honourable. You may have wondered what that means. Well, that is what it means. Unless persuaded, of course, to stand down or removed due to some scandal, such as in the case of the notorious Profumo affair in the early 1960s. John Profumo was the Secretary of State for War in the Conservative government of the time. And he had an extramarital affair with Christine Keeler, a 19-year-old model. He was found by police to have lied about the affair to the House of Commons, while a security breach was seen possible as it transpired that Keeler simultaneously had a relationship with a naval attaché from the Soviet Union. The scandal helped bring down Prime Minister Macmillan, who resigned. Such cases are rare, however. It was also in a period of time when people resigned, by the way, but that's another question. In fact, there are in 2022 a remarkable 700 Privy Councillors of political, judicial, ecclesiastical, civil service status. In pre-modern Scotland, a commission would rarely stretch to over 35 strong, although it did reach 50 in the 1660s. With meetings consisting of perhaps a dozen members, 9 was the quorum. Today, the president of the council, as of February 2022, is this guy, the Conservative MP, Mark Spencer, who chairs meetings of the UK Council, with generally half a dozen present, who always meet at the discretion of the government of the day. However, the Accession Council, which gathers on the death of a monarch, consists of all the members, and by tradition meets at St. James's Palace in London. In theory, all, though of course a selection of the 700, will assemble to witness the proclamation of succession for the new monarch, King Charles III, when he succeeds Queen Elizabeth II, who is now 95, of course. Privy councils became an important institutional feature in the development of pre-modern monarchy, government and administration throughout Europe. The English Privy Council, which also ceased to exist in 1708, clearly, traced its roots back to Norman times, and so does the Scottish. This was a process away from having a small coterie of clergymen and clerks who could read and write and administer, to a more formalised bureaucracy. In Scotland, the architecture of central administration was transformed in two main phases, although the relative decentralised nature of society compared to England and the behaviour of the Kings of Scots, who moved around a lot, meant that a specifically nodal bureaucracy took longer to appear. The first phase then stemmed from a period of Anglo-Normanisation in the 12th and 13th centuries, when appeared the posts of Chancellor, Chief Minister, Clerk Register, Keeper of the Records, and Secretary of State, Chief Clerk. A second phase of more centralising administrative reform occurred in the Renaissance period of the 15th and 16th centuries, as new institutions took hold, populated by increasing numbers of educated laymen. This is reflected in the establishment of various institutions, courts of justice, merchant guilds and urban centres, a greater representative engagement, both in a cultural and in an actual sense, by individual members of Parliament and their respective estates, clergy, towns, nobles in the Scottish Parliament. Clergy, towns and nobles are as medievals think of it, or medieval Scots thought of it, those who pray, those who toil, and those who fight. And also lastly, by the growing band of professional administrators coming together to coalesce into more formal council. The copying of administrative ideas from England and continental Europe was evident, and also by necessity, some political heavyweights were co-opted. Treasurer, Finance Minister, Controller, Administrator of the Royal Household, Lord Advocate, Chief Prosecutor, and Lord President of the Court of Session, Chief Justice, appear in this phase. In effect, these were the officers of state who sat in the Scottish Parliament, as well as the core of the commissioned to the Privy Council. In the late medieval period, some of these individuals were clergy, but there was a move away from this by the late 16th century after the Reformation. Essentially, as the religious politics of Scotland waxed and waned, bishops moved in and out of the Privy Council as they moved in and out of the Scottish Parliament, until finally at the Revolution of 1689, they exited both completely. What about uniqueness, which I said I would talk about? Well, Renaissance ideas that encouraged aristocrats to new professionals as opportunities arose to engage and represent, resulted in both monarchs and elites accepting the need for an executive body, the council. The Scottish political writer and parliamentarian Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun described this manifestation of civic virtue in his An Account of the Conversation Concerning a Right Regulation of Government of 1703. He wrote it as a dialogue. It's a classic humanist way to approach a topic. The catalyst for this engagement, or for these engagement opportunities, came from a combination of economic and institutional development, such as the expansion in the numbers of boroughs and markets from the 14th to the 17th centuries, along with the proliferation of administrative record keeping, an important feature. In the case of the Privy Council, however, the general acceptance of the authority of the body was vitally important. The conciliar movement of the 15th century was a factor, as we can see from Scotland's response to its ideas, which inspired the early 16th century Scottish historian and writer John Mayer to conclude that a council of cardinals should be the supreme authority over the Church of Rome. In his treatise on St. Matthew of 1518, seen here, Mayer stated that a council duly convened and representing the universal church is superior to the Pope. The issues being, what is to be done with a wayward Pope, and how do we define what is meant by the church? The Great Schism in the Church of Rome of 1378 to 1417 saw the appearance of a succession of clerical gatherings extending throughout the 15th to the early 16th centuries with the purpose of healing division. In what may seem a typical break with England in a situation of, well, that first saw 2 popes and briefly even 3, Scotland supported the claims of the Avignon papacy, while England preferred Rome. And Scotland's academics and writers, including Mayer and his predecessor John Ireland, drank in the beliefs of the University of Paris, where both studied and taught, that favoured the council side. While the papacy eventually took back control, ideas about relying on a group of councils continued to thrive in the secular world and gave legitimacy to these institutions, notwithstanding the Protestant Reformation in the likes of Scotland. Put simply, as Scotland's greatest pre-modern writer, George Buchanan, noted in his influential tract De Jure Reini Apud Scotus Dialogus of 1579, as a general rule, a multitude of people is a better judge of all affairs than an individual. Individuals have certain portions of virtue, which when brought together form a single outstanding virtue. Buchanan was no Democrat, and by the people he meant the elite, the commercial, landed, clerical, and academic elite. What underpinned his views of parliamentary sovereignty applied in small scale to the Privy Council as an executive. Those who gathered in council took decisions, while the wider populace accepted them. After King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, and the Union of the Crowns, or Regal Union as we sometimes call it, was joined in 1603, many politicians and writers, including Andrew Fletcher, came to condemn this union of 2 parliaments under 1 king. Even those who opposed the parliamentary union of 1707 were unhappy with the status quo and looked to find some way to make the constitutional settlement, or take the constitutional settlement back to a golden age, so-called, before 1603. However, in one respect, Scotland's political classes couldn't complain. Scotland's monarch moved to London, but its council remained in Edinburgh and sat in this building. While Scottish business was carried out in England's capital, with those Scots who happened to be present on occasion, sometimes with key English ministers, and also a Scottish council was briefly convened from 1661 to 63, there was no concerted attempt to set up a Scottish Privy Council in London. As the settlements were being established in England and Scotland at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, a standing committee was set up in London to advise the king on Scottish affairs. This council consisted of whichever Scottish Privy Councils were present, plus 6 Englishmen. It would be an exaggeration to say that this represented domination by the English, and most of the Scots outnumbered the English at these meetings. And it shouldn't be forgotten that since 1603, Scots, generally also 6 in number, were added to the English Privy Council. In the end, this London Council was abandoned in 1663, a victim of intrigue and rivalry between Scottish ministers in London and Edinburgh. Okay. Uniqueness. Given the more common arrangements found in European multiple monarchies, that is one king over more than one kingdom, it is remarkable that the Scottish Privy Council was maintained in Edinburgh. More usually in such cases, a viceroy would be sent north to act as the Westminster government's representative in Scotland and Scotland's representative at Westminster. Catalonia, in the Spanish situation, offers such an example. Catalonia had a viceroy located in Barcelona who was kept separate from the decision-making council of Aragon in Madrid. A provincial governor in the French manner might also be a possibility, acting as a petty king in the name of the actual monarch. But such proposals were anathema to the political classes and the Parliament of Scotland. In fact, various factors before and after 1603, I think, account for the Privy Council remaining in Scotland. These include the very fact that James VI was Scottish and had enough confidence in the political classes there. That his failed attempt at full parliamentary union between England and Scotland in 1604-6 necessitated falling back on existing structures. Thirdly, arrangements such as those made in 1589, whereby the Privy Council governed Scotland while the king was in Denmark agreeing his marriage to Princess Anna, pointed to future possibilities. And finally, the flexibility of business in London, where occasional Scottish matters could be considered in and around the English Council, diluted ideas of having a permanent Scottish council based in the English capital. While this enabled the council in Edinburgh to carry out its duties until 1708, the constitutional arrangement had its risks, as it gave considerable power to the Scottish Secretary in London, where he was a key conduit between council and monarch. Ultimately, the Scottish Privy Council ended with a whimper, not a bang. A victim of party politics in Scotland, with the excuse of the council's failure to deal adequately with the known plans of a Jacobite invasion, part of that movement to restore the Catholic line of Stuart monarchy, of course. This eventually emerged in a brief insurrection in support of an aborted French landing in March 1708. In fact, opposition politicians in Scotland had pressed for the demise of the council before this date, as they viewed the body as a vehicle for the ruling court party under the Duke of Queensberry, particularly when it came to the management of elections. A third party in Scotland, the Squadrone Volante, or Flying Squadron as it was called, existed at the Union, that was neither of the court party nor the country party. And it believed that closer union with England would bring the end of the Queensberry ministry in Scotland, better secure the Protestant succession and Scotland from the threat of Jacobitism, and also keep their party relevant. The position of the council was weak in these circumstances. Unlike Scotland's other educational, legal and religious institutions preserved by the clauses of the Treaty of Union, the council was affirmed in vague terms Article 19 of the treaty, which states, after the Union, the Queen's Majesty and her royal successors may continue a Privy Council in Scotland for preserving of public peace and order until the Parliament of Great Britain shall think fit to alter it or establish any other effectual method for that end. And so, aware of the pressures for votes to continue to fund the war effort during the War of the Spanish Succession, which went from 1701 to 14, the government conceded the abolition of the Scottish Council on the 1st of May 1708, precisely 12 months since the commencement of parliamentary union, a remarkable anniversary actually. Ironically, the lack of a central executive authority in Edinburgh with access to local intelligence and the power to take swift action merely encouraged Jacobitism, which of course brought about the famous rebellions of 1715 and 1745. How do we assess the significance of the Scottish Privy Council? Well, The Scottish Parliament, the legislature, met for periods of a few months or more, and in some years not at all. Whereas the council, the executive, convened on a daily and weekly basis, making it able to deal with long-term policy matters, but also immediate issues. It behaved somewhat like a modern-day cabinet, and its records are the nearest we have to cabinet papers for pre-modern Scotland, hence the importance of our project. The competencies of the council were very wide and confirm a significant role in religious, political, social, and economic spheres, as is evidenced from the circumstances and events in the period of the Scottish Privy Council project from the Revolution of 1689 to 1708. It is an extraordinary period of social history and council policy in areas such as the poor law, family, personal conduct, marriage, leisure, rights and freedoms, and social welfare. In domestic and international economic policy, in the context of the prevailing belief in mercantilism, that is, using tariffs to maximize exports and minimize imports, we see the council granting monopolies and patents, imposing price controls and import and export duties, levying taxation, as well as responding to the creation in 1695 and subsequent near collapse of the Bank of Scotland and the failed Darien scheme of 1698 to 1700, that final attempt to cure the Scotland's economic woes by a costly plan to set up a trading colony at Panama. We see an example here of the subscription list for the Company of Scotland, to which Fletcher Saltoun subscribed £1,000 in the equivalent of £100,000 nowadays, although it's likely that he only actually paid 2/3 of that. But it's still a big sum. He was reasonably wealthy. In the same period, politics and religion intersected, and council business included political management of elections and of the Scottish Parliament, the ebb and flow of Anglo-Scottish relations, national security, and in religion, the re-establishment of Presbyterianism in 1690, and attempts by the Crown to promote toleration of Episcopalians, while at the same time monitoring the activities of Jesuits and Catholic cells. The activities of the Parliament and Council were interwoven, with the former devolving to the Council full authority over some matters, while the Council had clear responsibility to ensure that Acts of Parliament were adhered to on the ground. This wide range of council business is best illustrated, I think, by examples from the period in question. Killiecrankie, the battle thereof in Perthshire in July 1689, the first of the counter-revolutionary engagements fought by Jacobites. 2 weeks after the battle, at which the Jacobites were victorious but lost their commander, John Graham, Viscount Dundee, Bonnie Dundee, of course, 7 women petitioned the council for assistance. These women were the widows of English soldiers who had died in the fighting against Dundee. They requested a fund to allow them and their children to return to England, and in the meantime, money to maintain themselves. The council instructed the receiver of His Majesty's Crown rents and foreign excise to make a small payment to each of them. On a much larger scale, a council proclamation concerning beggars was issued in August 1692, instructing all beggars to return to their own parishes and that heritors, that is landowners, be taxed to help the genuine poor. As years of national famine set in for the remainder of the 1690s, the so-called biblical seven ill years, and the greatest national demographic disaster since the Black Death in the 14th century, councillors regularly concerned themselves with attempts to help a struggling population. We have to remember that in some parts of Scotland, 25 to 30% of the population died during these 1690s famines. It was extraordinarily bad, especially in Aberdeenshire. Foreign policy and external affairs also engaged with varying scale. Kaliningrad, is the name we give Königsberg from the early modern period. Königsberg was in Prussia. Kaliningrad is in Russia now. But in April 1697, the community of Scots in Königsberg appealed to the Privy Council to be allowed to begin a voluntary collection in the parishes of Scotland to help them build a new church, permission for which had been given by the Duke of Brandenburg. This was duly granted by the council. And there's typical examples of this kind of small detail from Scottish communities abroad. However, of much greater significance was the decision of the council, which it made in May 1702, between the death of King William in February and the summoning of a session of the Scottish Parliament in June under Queen Anne, to declare war against France and Spain, and to take an unwilling Scotland into the recently begun War of the Spanish Succession. For many parliamentarians, the council had gone too far. Combined with a sense of grievance and English opposition to the Darien scheme, this led to anti-government electoral successes in the election of 1702-3, creating a minority government and helping build up resentment in the Scottish Parliament, which culminated in a piece of legislation called the Act Anent Peace of War of 1703. This affirmed the Parliament's right to assent to such action as declaring war, and set in motion the Anglo-Scottish crisis leading to the political union with England. This is debatable. You could say that what set it in motion were other factors much earlier, but this is certainly an important stage. Moving to the actual Privy Council project, I'd like to talk about this briefly. As well as researching this, the SPCP, the Scottish Privy Council project, has a second objective: creating an online resource for students, researchers, and the public. The relevant website is due to be launched the summer of 2024, hosted by Stirling University, before, after some years, moving to the National Record of Scotland's People, the genealogical gateway, which many of you will know. But while the research agenda of the project starts from the Revolution of 1689, the editing of the manuscript records will span the years 1692 to 1708. Why the start date? Well, this arises from pure chance. Between 1877 and 1970, printed volumes of the council registers were published, but no published editions exist for the years 1692 to 1708. Also, fortuitous is that in the 1960s, typescripts were made of the manuscript public registers kept at the National Records of Scotland, and also kept there were these transcripts, with a view to printed publication covering the years 1692 to 1708. But the publishing was prevented by lack of funding. Now, this is one of several junctures for the online resource, the Records of the Parliaments of Scotland to 1708, which some of you may know and of which I am co-editor, becomes a template. The Records of the Parliament of Scotland is the most important online resource in the study of pre-modern Scottish history, and it's an exemplar in digital humanities. Using it as a methodological mold, where the 19th century printed volumes of the Acts of the Parliament of Scotland were scanned using optical character recognition to create a master record, scanning has been undertaken of these Privy Council transcripts to accelerate markedly the process of text capture. And what you see here in this slide is on the left, the 1960s transcripts in typical 1960s foolscap typescripts, mechanical typewriter in actually blue and black ink. Extraordinary. I remember this. I'm old enough for that, sadly. Scanned into what you have on the right-hand side of the page, which is what we're using for our a resource. This way, anyway, a foundation text representing perhaps 80% of the whole and consisting of about 5 million words has been created. Additional manuscript material not in typescript form has been gathered from other archives, of course. And one of the most significant features of the records of the Parliaments of Scotland is the creation of its parallel modernised translation of the parliamentary record. And you see on this screen a screenshot from the records of the Parliament of Scotland with the manuscript record on one side and the transcribed record on the right, sitting next to each other. The translation is necessitated by the problems of searching a digital database with no standard spelling. Such precision, I tell my undergraduate students, was a product of the 18th century. Up until that point, it didn't really matter how you spelt as long as you were understood. In effect, the translation will provide a detailed standardized index of the entire database, enabling an almost infinite number of search terms by computer. Therefore, the core aim of this project to create a free-to-access online edition covering these years will be achieved and at the same time enable the project team to explore policy and action by the Council in the reigns of William and Mary and Queen Anne. Now, departing from direct discussion of my project, I'd like to now focus on someone who was never a Privy Councillor, actually, Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun, mentioned before regarding civic virtue. That's an important thing, civic virtue. Why else would I be talking about him when he's not a Privy Councillor? He was a Brexiteer of a different sort from the breed we hear about in the UK today. Brexiteers, you know, those who support leaving the European Union. He is also something of a Scottish national hero. He died just over 300 years ago in September 1716, in fact, and his date of birth is a bit uncertain. And because of that, a lecture has been given each September since the 1960s at the parish church of Saltoun, 20 miles east of Edinburgh, where he is buried. By the 1960s, the first significant wave of political Scottish nationalism had arrived, supplanting in national importance the Scottish literary renaissance in the first half of the 20th century. The movement from culture to politics was in some respects a reflection of Fletcher himself, as we shall see. In the last few years, the Fletcher lecture has been hijacked by the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, and the venue is now there, and the timing is more variable. So, who is our man? What made this Scot Exeter? Fletcher was the son of Sir Robert Fletcher, descended from a legal family, and his mother's surname was Bruce, and she claimed descent from Robert the Bruce, no less. Andrew succeeded his father to the family estate in 1665 and was in his early years educated by the moderate local minister, Gilbert Burnet, the future English, the Bishop of Salisbury in England, and the major historian of the period that some of you may have heard of. From 1669 to 77, Fletcher toured and was educated in Europe, spending long periods in Paris, London, and The Hague, becoming fluent in French and Italian, and buying books all over the place. He built up the largest private library in Scotland at the time, some 6,000 books. He was elected to the Scottish Parliament in 1678 and promptly joined opposition to the authoritarian administration of the Duke of Lauderdale, Charles II's chief man in Scotland. Then he sat in opposition in 1681 when James, Duke of Albany in York, Charles's brother and the future James II, who I spoke about last time, of course, succeeded Lauderdale in the management of Scottish affairs. And Fletcher even encouraged rejection of the Act of Succession in favour of the Catholic James. Fletcher had troops quartered on his lands as a punishment, and after being accused before the Privy Council in 1682 of obstructing that quartering, wisely went into exile in 1683. When James succeeded to the throne, Fletcher came over with the Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II, to support a Protestant rebellion, of course, but avoided the ignominious fate, execution of Monmouth, and sailed back to the continent. In a notorious event, typical of his proud personality, he shot stone dead the banker of the rebellion, a certain Thomas Dare, after the latter caned him for taking his horse to lead a scouting party. Fletcher had to be sent away by Monmouth, exile, forfeiture of the family estates, being tried for treason in absentia followed on. So perhaps unsurprisingly, when the revolution against James occurred, Fletcher came over in the wake of William of Orange. While he was involved in politics and wrote about various aspects in the 1690s, it was 1703 before he re-entered Parliament. Burnet said of Fletcher that he was a gentleman of great parts and many virtues, a most virulent Republican, and most passionate and indiscreet asserter of public liberty. In other words, in a period of corrupt politics, he could not be bought. Just looking at the titles of the lectures delivered in his memory since the 1960s confirm how he's viewed today. The words pioneer, patriot, example appear, but above all, relevance. In Scotland, the context of that relevance has been an unprecedented period of referendums in firstly achieving devolved government, which, in the eyes of the UK government and parties, countered pressure for independence. Resentment at a democratic deficit, as it was perceived in Scotland. Understood to different degrees by all the political parties in Scotland. So initially a failed devolution referendum in 1979, where just the majority said yes, but without reaching the required 40% of all those who could vote. But an overwhelmingly successful one in 1997, and finally in a failed independence referendum in 2014. What had happened? The failure of party politics since the late 1970s, especially for the Conservatives in Scotland and Labour in England. The unprecedented move from local industries to globalisation. And more recently in the 21st century, the populist soup of digital media and post-factualism has seen Fletcher recast as a champion of an alternative way, integrity. And of course, the 2016 European Union referendum has seen England say leave and Scotland remain. From the Conservative governments of the 1980s and 90s, which used Scotland as a test laboratory for an unpopular poll tax, and ended up with no MPs in Scotland whatever, to the stumbling into a European Union referendum result that horrifies most Scots. It's hard to see how Westminster and the UK has been responding to Scottish interests. Union has been failing, but which one? UK or EU? In 1703, Fletcher was concerned with another failing union, the union of the crowns, which began so hopefully in 1603, but by 1703 was in crisis. By the late 1690s, Fletcher had begun to put in writing various tracts about the state of Scotland and the qualities of good government. Here he had already realised that King William was no more interested in Scottish affairs than Charles II and James the Seventh and Second. The Scottish political community was obsessed essentially with three issues. Firstly, with the English government and Parliament opting, without consulting Scotland, to solve the succession crisis before William's death by passing an Act of Security in 1701. This declared, after the succession of Queen Anne, that the crown would pass to the Princess of Hanover. Secondly, with their decision, without Scottish input, to go to war against the French in 1702. Thirdly, with the widely perceived feeling that Scotland's best made to cure its ailing economy, the Darien scheme, had been sabotaged by English interests. The hung parliament that assembled in Edinburgh in 1703 was in uproar and uncontrollable. Fletcher's critique was expressed in a speech in the chamber in May of that year. Our laws before the Union of the Crowns were full of acts to secure our liberty. Those laws that have been made since that time are directed chiefly to extend the prerogative. All our affairs since the Union of the Crowns have been managed by the advice of English ministers and the principal officers of the kingdom, filled with such men as a court of England knew would be subverted to their designs. The difficulty we labour under is of the two kingdoms which have different interests governed by the same king. Finally, he concluded, Scotland now appeared more like a conquered province than a free, independent people. The 1703 sessions proved a disaster for the Crown. Firstly, in 1703, that Act of Peace and War I mentioned was passed, stating that Parliament must retain the sovereign right to declare war. Also, after much debate, a Scottish Act of Security was passed. And with pressure to get urgent taxation agreed, Queen Anne temporarily approved this in 1704. This act declared that Scotland had the right to choose the succession to the Crown of Scotland, regardless of England. This might seem odd, but this was not an attempt to have a different line of succession, but to make sure that if it had the same monarch, then certain generalised conditions should apply beyond the coronation oath, and that the Scottish Parliament would become the guarantor of Scottish sovereignty. In terms of the succession before the passing of these acts, Fletcher argued strongly to include more extensive limitations, as he called them, to provide meaningful guarantees about Scottish interests under shared monarchy, and also if parliamentary union took place, which English ministers rather were beginning to see more clearly as a solution to the Scottish problem. His limitations included the following, a remarkable list actually. Annual parliaments, members choosing their own president, new peerages granted by the Crown to be matched by new elected chair members, remembering that the Scottish Parliament sat in one chamber, by the way. Nobles sat with elected MPs. No rights of the monarch to refuse to pass acts. No power of the monarch to declare war or peace or agree treaties without Parliament. All offices, civil or military, to be confirmed by Parliament. Parliament to approve all pardons. All law lords to be excluded from Parliament and other offices. An armed militia of men aged 16 to 60 to be maintained. And finally, if the monarch broke these conditions, the estates would declare she or he had forfeited the crown. Given the slow rollout of reform bills in 19th century Britain, these were radical. In the end, in spite of attempting in 1703 and 4 to have these limitations included in legislation, they were rejected by the Parliament as too extreme. But the fact that they were debated and supported by some confirms the accepted weakness of the Union of the Crowns. For example, that the sovereignty of the Scottish Parliament had been insufficient to put into full force legislation that supported the Darien scheme. Essentially, Fletcher argued, the very fact of the Revolution of 1689 proved that the government of Scotland had always been a limited monarchy, especially before 1603, of course. The text of the final agreed Act of Security did include the arming and training of militia. A provocation to England, no doubt. But Fletcher's reason for this more extended clause in his limitations was down to belief that one of the foundations of tyranny was the standing army, a thought in the mind of Englishmen at the Revolution of 1689. Now, the Scottish standing army was very small compared to England's by then. Yet for Fletcher, the citizenry had to be armed, arms being the only true badge of liberty, he said. No wonder Fletcher has been applauded in the USA, and Thomas Jefferson was a great admirer. Described by some as a Machiavellian, Fletcher supported the great Florentine's view that arms bearing and citizenship went hand in hand, as in the Roman Republic, signifying public virtue. Whereas if the people put defence in the hands of mercenaries, then they're likely to suffer political slavery under the arbitrary rule of a tyrant. The trouble is that the whole of Europe was doing just this. And so Fletcher's ideas became a critique of the continent and not merely the British Isles. Fletcher, the idealist, the philosophical Don Quixote, perhaps. Meanwhile, his link with the Enlightenment was his fixation with the importance of virtue. As the discussions about parliamentary union grew more intense, Fletcher also took a strong anti-union stance, wishing to preserve the relative independence of Scotland. He became particularly opposed to the incorporating union ideas circulating in 1705, which of course actually happened in 1707. That is, where the Scottish Parliament is folded into the Westminster Parliament, stuffed into it. Although this signified that the separate states of England and Scotland ceased to exist, it was clear to Fletcher that the problems of the regal union would be intensified. But Fletcher didn't oppose union per se, and felt a union could save Scotland's liberties from Jacobite invasion. No, it was the type of union being tabled which alarmed him. The word federal is a problem for Americans and Europeans trying to understand each other. To you, following your Civil War, of course, the federal government is the central government, and federalism is a term for centralization. Whereas to Europeans, from Fletcher to today, federalism is about decentralization and giving power to regions. To further confuse us, confederal union, where a union of sovereign states would arise, was often championed by Fletcher, which was in 1703 and 4 seen as a genuine alternative to incorporating union. A union of the three kingdoms, including Ireland, of course, would be dominated by the largest, England. And so it was essential, as he saw it, to reach a state of equality between the kingdoms. This would involve breaking up the traditional sovereignties of both England and Scotland, taking them back to pre-Norman conquest days of separate regional kingdoms. The Swiss cantons were one of his preferred models, in which republics, or limited monarchies, consist of free men governing one another, rather than elites and nobles governing in a kind of festering feudalism. However, even though some of the young and idealistic MPs followed Fletcher like a guru and marvelled at his speeches and intelligence, most had by 1705 come to realise that utopia was impossible. Three parliaments with some kind of imperial diet in the middle might preserve some Scottish interests before becoming drowned in incorporation. England would still dominate, as it would never agree to its own internal devolution. Fletcher wrote that all of Europe knew of Scotland's hatred of all strangers. It's sometimes said that Scotland is a good European. I'm sure you've heard the idea. Look at the tradition of continental education dating back to medieval times. A legal system unlike that of England based on Roman law. An outstanding contribution to the European Enlightenment unmatched by England. And of course, the majority of Scots voting Remain in the EU referendum of 2016. However, Scotland's relative enthusiasm for Europe is not so straightforward. After joining in 1973, in the 1975 referendum over whether the UK should remain in the EEC, as it then was, 62% of Scots voted Remain, while 66% of English did so. It is England that has become disillusioned with the EU. In retrospect, 1975 is a very odd referendum. The Scottish National Party supporting Leave. Today, it supports Remain. Mrs. Thatcher supporting Remain, her successors or heirs in the right wing of the Conservative Party, they support Leave. And Northern Ireland was the only part of the UK voting Leave in 75, and in the recent referendum, it voted Remain. Wow. Fletcher would have found this bemusing, as do I, to be honest. His philosophical foundations were European, and so he not only looked to the Dutch Republic as a template for an Anglo-Scottish confederation, but also looked at Europe more widely. He even wrote a pamphlet in Italian to oppose the domination of Europe by a combination of the royal houses of Spain and France. In his 1703 tract, An Account of a Conversation, title page seen here on your left, which I mentioned earlier, of course, he explains his vision for the complete restructuring of Europe on federalist lines. This would allow Scotland and other states to be self-sustaining, be defended by militias, with no desirable wish for conquest, with no danger of universal monarchy, and be part of an international economy organized largely on agrarian lines, so that commerce would no longer be an excuse for hostility and war. Within states, city-states would exist which own the region about them. The dreadful domination for the likes of London and Paris would be avoided by a redistribution of urban centres within rural hinterlands. A new series of regional capitals would be created. In England, these would be Bristol, Exeter, Chester, Norwich, York, and London. And in Scotland, Stirling and Inverness, not even Edinburgh. You can see on the map here what this would look like. It would be a Europe of the regions. Fantasy or fiction? This places Fletcher in the forefront of our debate today. He was no Democrat and even controversially advocated temporary slavery as a solution to the dreadful economic woes and famine faced by Scotland in the 1690s as beggars lined the streets. But his work not merely sees him reject centralization, but also reject globalization. Had Fletcher voted in the European Union referendum of 2016, he would have voted Remain, but then campaigned for a reformed European Union with more powers devolved from Brussels to the regions of Europe. For Scotland, he would argue, the existing EU is not the answer, but nor is ruled by Westminster. In a sense, therefore, both unions have failed, just as in 1603 and 1707, a series of failed marriages. And what of the Privy Council then? We have no record of how Fletcher voted over Article 19 of the Treaty of Union, especially the clause relating to the retention of the Scottish Council subject to the Parliament of Great Britain. It seems likely that he would have voted against it on principle, as it did over so much else in the last months of the Parliament's life. Although he was a victim of the Council in the 1690s, he would have voted to retain a Scottish Council, but one controlled by a Scottish Parliament. In terms of government, the two expression of virtue in representation and service meant the executive was always answerable to Parliament. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alastair. This is absolutely fascinating. And your current research work has been surrounding all of this, has it not?
Yep, it absolutely has. Yeah, certainly. Let me get rid of my PowerPoint thing here. Right, here we go. It certainly has. Yeah, well, there are 7 of us, so it's quite a management exercise, as well as I find I'm spending more time holding budget meetings than I am. So I have to confess that one of the advantages of seniority is that you can control the money and talk about other people's ideas. No, that's cynical, but it's very intense, and so my retirement is half baked, to say the least, because of that. Anyway.
We're grateful that you've returned to academia. I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments and dialogue with Alastair, please. Bruce, did you have a question or a comment?
Just delighted with the presentation, by the way, Alastair. And I can only promise that I'm going to infest the Privy Council website in the near future.
Well, it's if I hope when if you use the records of the Palms of Scotland website, it's going to be it's the kind of template. So if you find that useful, I hope that the Privy Council one covers a shorter period of time. It's about a quarter of the size in terms of words and so on. But I hope it will be as useful. But it's a big area because if you're talking about all government, you're talking about so many different things. We've got two of the team are looking at economic and social history. Two of them are looking at political and religious history. And the three full-time academics, we're all over the place. One of us is looking at justice because the Privy Council was a court as well. I'm supposed to be writing a monograph about the history of the council, so I'm looking at everything, which is why I've been talking about uniqueness and universality, because every time you go to an international conference, you're asked, how special is the Scottish thing? And it's tiresome, to be honest with you, because of course it's special. Why do I need to justify it? But anyway, but it sometimes it takes a bit of time to go through this kind of hoop, because when you're speaking to, Austrian and Japanese historians, you need to kind of, explain it. But so I'm doing a bit of that, and I've got another colleague who's looking at the relationship between local government and the council, looking at how boroughs engage with it, appealing for things. I mean, sometimes they're looking for a grant of money to rebuild a bridge that's collapsed in a storm or something, or at other times they're appealing to the council to nullify an election to the local council that some consider a corrupt election. This kind of thing. It's quite interesting. So they're all over the place. Anyway, what can I tell you?
Alastair, this may not correlate with your focus at all, and I don't mean to be going off on a tangent.
Please do.
I'm just wondering if within your research on the Scottish Privy Council, did you uncover any information on the Lords of Secret Council, which were said to be part of the general body of the Lords of Council in the early 1500s as a precursor to the Scottish Privy Council?
Yeah, well, this is a kind of complicated thing. The Secret Council is the Privy Council, right? It's used to mean the same thing, and sometimes it's called secret, sometimes it's called privy. Okay?
I see.
And however, there are moments when there's a council within a council, and you find that one of the problems that my guy James VII and II had is that he started to try and do business through a kind of half a dozen core people in the centre. And it meant that other Privy Council, like the Duke of Hamilton, Bruce, felt a bit resentful that they were left out of important decision-making. But because some of the time when you're in crisis, you have to have whoever's present, whoever's in Edinburgh, if you're stuck away in Orkney, you're not going to be there, are you? So you can't be summoned in time. So naturally, you tend to gravitate towards using those people who happen to be there. So the Provost of Edinburgh, for example, is a regular attendant because he's there, and he represents the towns clearly in as much as he can. So it was quite important to get the right person. So there's some controversies about electing the Edinburgh Provost because of that. But yeah, so it's a slightly if you look at the Spanish monarchy, for example, in the late 16th century, they had a grand council and they had a council of the night, which sounds like something naughty, but it's just that they met after dark, you know, and that was how that was a kind of little group. So that's a similar idea where you might have a kind of core group, and then you might have a wider council. Now the question is, if you're making a really important decision, somewhat like a parliament, you'd have to have as many people there as possible because you need consent. You need a lot of people to be present when something important was happening. Okay, but you didn't need everybody present if it was day-to-day stuff. Okay, and a committee would deal with this. The committees are endless in the Privy Council as well. I mean, just as I mentioned, the modern day UK Privy Council has a committee that looks at education things. They have a judicial committee that looks at appeals for the death sentence and so on. And in the pre-modern period, you had a committee looking at economic issues, security, matters to do with the church. And you had ad hoc ones looking at an individual court case, for example, that would gather evidence. Or it would say, you have people saying the price of bread was too high, and they would be thinking, is it too high? So they have a committee to look at whether the price of bread was too high or not, or whether they had to do something like ban imports of bread to protect the local producers or whatever it was. So there's lots of stuff going on. Yeah. Hello, Don. Yes.
So this Privy Council, I mean, your investigations are basically because there's a lot of data that was hidden or not published for many years. So it's a curiosity project. And it's essentially a small executive council working for the King of Scotland.
Well, yeah.
American, this is arcane to say the least. Yeah. So I'm just trying to put it into some kind of structure. So, I mean, this is to me, it seems like a relatively small council, either working for the king or working for the parliament or both. I'm not sure.
Well, I think, sorry, have you finished? Yeah, it's both. It does work for the king. He works through it, actually, if you like. He issues, proclamations and so on. The council publishes them, or sometimes they send it back to the monarch saying that's a bit too strong. You might want to reword that. So there's a kind of discussion between the king and the council. But also there's a particular circumstance when the king's in London and the council's in Edinburgh when it comes to this kind of thing. So they have discretion about dealing with stuff. And also they sometimes don't do what they're told.
Okay.
If they don't like it. Like, for example, in the 1690s, a lot of people hadn't decided, am I actually keen on the new regime of William of Orange? Am I still kind of okay about the chap James across the water? So a lot of people hedging their bets. What you might call soft Jacobites in the Parliament, who are sympathetic or kind of hadn't quite decided, right? So in that group of people, you would find when the Crown said, we want you to execute Jacobites, they'd be saying, no, let's just clap them on the hand and say, no, don't do that, you naughty boy. The unwillingness to go to severe measures. And also, if you know your...
Especially for a Dutchman, right?
Especially for Dutchman. Well, yeah, oddly enough, the Dutchness of William was more of a negative in England as it was in Scotland, actually, but because the Dutch connection with Scotland was very strong. In fact, the religious connection was strong, but the educational one. But there was even an idea at the Union that some had that instead of a union with England, you could have a union with Holland instead. So that was an idea that was because we traded them so much. Why that's an option, and it seems like a wild idea now as we look at it because they're not joined to each other.
Well, not with the Dutch Republic. I mean, it was so the prestige, the power, the money.
Yeah, but I thought you were going to ask me whether it was like the president having his team, in the States, whether it's like that. I mean, I suppose you could make the case that it's a bit like that, in the sense that you get, you've got your Secretary of State, you've got your Chief Economic Secretary, whatever it is. I can't remember what the terms are. Excuse me. you've got that kind of people, right? They exist and they are more likely to be under control by the crown than the others. But not everybody who's in the council is an officer of state. You know, they're not being appointed by the king. They're originally there because the king said, well, let's have them. But sometimes the king does it because there are different factions in politics. And well, we need to have a few guys because you need to hold your enemies close, kind of stuff. You need to have some of the opposition in your government, kind of thing. So that means that there would be people in the council who didn't approve of things. So another example is the reign of Charles I. Now, some of you might remember that he came up with a prayer book, okay, that people didn't like in Scotland because it's seen as too English, okay? And this new prayer book, which had things like English saints' days and all that stuff, which Scottish Presbyterians thought was too Catholic-like for them, and it started a revolution, which eventually ended up with Charles losing his head, of course, in more ways than one. But that the council in Scotland was told, you have to insist that everybody buys this book and reads it. And the council went, well, not really, you know, yeah, you know, we're fine. We've got Bibles. We're okay. You know, so in other words, it could because of 1603 and the king going south, you could do that kind of thing more easily, which is odd, isn't it? Because I've just been telling you that the political classes in Scotland thought that things were better before 1603 when the king was sitting in the room. Whereas after 1603, and he's down there most of the time, a few times he turned up, you know, it was worse. So that's a strange counterintuitive idea, isn't it? But there you go.
So the Privy becomes sort of like its own little government with the king down in the south. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. I mean, I suppose would you in the colonial period, there must be some parallels that we can draw here with you guys. That you know, you had your parliament, your representative assemblies, and you know, some people were kind of appointed with you know the seal of the crown on them and so on. But
yeah, then there's
you know, but yeah, but governors and so forth. But I mean, they became you know, they become local. You know, they become native. You see what I mean? They start to do things that not necessarily guys across the Atlantic want to happen, and that was happening in Scotland a bit as well.
That's interesting.
Yep. Yep.
Other questions for Alastair? You know, I have a quick one, Alastair. Your commentary on the referendum and the fact that the unions had been failing, and then you said, but which union, the UK or the EU? I'm wondering if you wouldn't elaborate a little more on that. I'm very interested in the current situation, but also the former.
Yeah, it's just that you need to explain how, if you go back to the 1950s, there was an election, I can't remember which one it was, where the Conservatives had the majority of MPs in Scotland. You hardly believe that. That was impossible to believe now, but it was the case. So clearly there was some kind of post-war acceptance of that. Of course, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister after, well, not straight away, but later. And he was obviously popular for reasons that you can well imagine. So something had happened since then. And you've got to say that up until the 1970s, Scottish nationalism was a kind of tea party. You know, it wasn't really a political party of any strength at all. But in the 1970s, things started to kind of take off a bit. And it was in this period of time when there was a resentment at the low number of government MPs sitting in Scotland, but telling us what to do. Now, we talked about this, I think I mentioned this last time to you, I think I did, that some in England consider, you'll find this as Scotophiles yourself odd, but those English who talk about the Soviet Republic of Scotland, right? Who they see it as being a kind of left-wing cabal that does things in certain ways. Well, we have a stronger state in Scotland than you have in England, in the sense that back in the 1960s, for example, there was more state housing in Scotland than any other country in Europe outside the Soviet Union, right? So the housing stock of council housing was incredibly large as a proportion. And our politics is more collective than England's is. Okay, so there's that difference. Now we can't overdo it because my mother was a member of the Conservative Party, so there's all sorts of stuff going on here. But all I'm saying is that difference is there. So as you get less and less MPs in Westminster, you start to think, well, why are we voting all these people who are Labour, SNP, Liberal Party as our MPs in Scotland, when in England it's a Conservative Party that rules nearly all the time, and they're not doing what we want to happen. So you create this kind of resentment. So hence referendums, devolution as the answer, recreate a Scottish Parliament that can address Scottish issues, and of course a Welsh Parliament that deals with Welsh issues, a Northern Ireland Assembly that deals with issues there too. So that devolution becomes popular. But within England, it's been very, very slow to happen. And even with the EU referendum victory for those who wanted to leave, what's happened is the powers, lots of the powers that have been in Brussels, powers, decisions, legislation, have not come back to Scotland, even in areas that it has involvement in, like fishing, for example. It's gone to Westminster. So there's been a huge uproar in the Scottish Parliament saying, look, we had more say in fishing in Scotland in the European Union than we now have, because you've taken the powers back from us. So in other words, what's happened is the Westminster Parliament has taken over a lot of all this stuff. And there are many in Scotland who think that actually they have more trust in people in Europe doing this than they do with a bunch of lawyers who are running the Parliament in London. So that's one view. I'm not saying it's necessarily my opinion. It's a bit of a cartoon image I'm giving you, but you get the idea. Yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question again?
Of course.
Okay. So I take it that with deindustrialization in Scotland, starting in the 70s, the oil shocks, that's when basically the Scottish National Party began to really grab hold, right?
Yeah, it had a dip. It had a dip in the 80s, but it went up, down, and then back up again.
And down in England, basically had all the financialization in London, where manufacturing's out and bonds are in stocks. Kind of like that.
I guess so. I mean, to be honest with you, some of this is a false narrative, because there's no doubt about it that there's a hair's breadth between the working people of Newcastle and the working people of Glasgow. I mean, most of the problem is what Fletcher Saltoun said it was. It's London that's the problem. I mean, maybe to you guys, New York's a problem. I don't know, but London is a problem, right? And whereas people in Newcastle feel the same kind of alienation that people in Glasgow do about what's going on. It's one of those things. Policy seems to be driven by what suits the financial sector in London and so on, and not manufacturing in Newcastle, Manchester, Glasgow, and so forth. I have to, those of you who've been in Scotland know, however, there are pressures in Scotland too. You get an Edinburgh guy and a Glasgow guy in a pub, they'll end up, throwing punches at each other sometimes. So it's just the way life is. I don't know. I'm from Aberdeen. I'm a neutral, so it's all right. But yeah.
Well, Alastair, I think, I'm afraid we're short on time. I wish we'd scheduled this for a longer period, but we just can't thank you enough for this very interesting presentation and dialogue today. And I will be in touch with you because we'd love to have you back for another presentation. So
we have friends who live in Cedar Rapids, which is
yes.
My wife's been over and she flew to Chicago and then down. So
I remember that.
I think so that will happen. And what I would love to do is to actually meet you all in person, because it's fine, teams, but so You probably can tell from my kind of, that I tend to move around when I'm talking. So I think I must seem like a madman sometimes on these screens. But anyway, I hope to do that. And it'd be lovely to actually see you in person and visit you, Connie. So that would be a plan. If not, I'm happy to talk again if you can bear that.
Just let us know when you can come,
All
and
right.
we'll roll out the red carpet for you. As I've offered before, you and your family can stay at my house at the Hotel Nestor. So
Okay.
come on over. We'd be delighted to host you.
Thank you for that. And thank
Yes.
you, Jack, for your organizational skills as well. Right.
Yes, Jack, thank you for everything you do. And Gus, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jack.
That it's so important to us to have you with us. And I really want to thank everyone for joining today, and to remind you that we hope we'll see you again next month on May 7th, when Dr. Bruce Allardyce, JD, instructor, social and behavioral science, history and political science, returns to us again. And Bruce, who has been with us today, is going to speak to us on Border Reavers, the unknown clans of the lowlands. So that'll be very exciting. And Alastair, you're welcome anytime, of course.
Just going to say, could I have that link sent to me, please?
Well, get you on the list.
I will wind up an awkward question for you, Bruce. That's why. No, I'd be interested in joining that if I can. But hold on, that would have to be at some extraordinarily bad time of the day, would it, or something? If
it would be now. It would be the same time as now on the first Saturday.
That's fine.
So yes,
That's fine. Excellent.
We'll count on you. Well, I'm sure Bruce will count on you, and you'll become great friends when you come to Chicago. Okay, folks. So next month, May 7th, same time, same station. In the meanwhile, stay safe, and thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Alastair.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Nice job.
Bye-bye.